Everyone. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon as per your time zone. And welcome to the Bella Vista Western City Salesforce Developer Group. Thank you for registering and joining the today's session. Today we have Josh Dennis, Salesforce functional lead, working with Deloitte Digital Australia with us, who's sharing about the designing Salesforce solution for reuse. Yeah, a little bit about myself. I am Shaktivel Madhes. I am senior Salesforce developer working with Tech4 Services and also Salesforce MEP and community group leader for the Bella Vista, Australia. And I am actively available for the social channels, so you can reach out to me anytime in those social channels. Today agenda, as I mentioned, we have Josh Dennis with us to sharing her knowledge about the designing Salesforce solution for reuse. And end of the session, we are planning to give away 3 Salesforce certification voucher for the random participants. Please fill your information in this link. I will share the link in the chat window. And finally, the summary and resources. And in that note, actually, we have like Salesforce introduced the new policy. The person will get the 3 quotes per. If you have already received the 3 certification code from any Trailblazer community group, then please don't submit your name, so you are not eligible. Group overview, join the member as in the group, the link, and participate either as a speaker or participants. And we have chatter group, Twitter and LinkedIn and YouTube channel also. Try to join and be active. And upcoming meetings, we are looking the speaker also. If anyone interested to share your technical knowledge through community, please fill the information or reach out to me. We will try to plan for the upcoming months. Some of the news and updates and announcement. Dreamforce 2021. Salesforce have just opened the registration for the 3-day the Dreamforce event. It's accessible worldwide. It's September 22 and 24 in the APAC regions. So register now and save it in your calendar and explore all the Salesforce related features and products updates. And TrialGate guest, this month they have 3 TrialGate guests available. If you are learning fun way to learning the TrialGate, then go ahead and complete those guests. And Winter 22 release also available. Last week, they released the release notes and pre-release are also available. I think today is a cutoff day for the sandbox, and hopefully some of your sandbox, you will get the Winter 22 release features also. And then SOQL query field in VS Code, it's generally available. So you can use that VS Code for building your SOQL query. Then Salesforce developer team actively recording some key features for the development related topics, and it's available in the Salesforce developer YouTube channel in the playlist. So try to watch it out. It's 10 minutes video only for topics. Try to watch whenever you have time. And then next one about the super badge, you are aware as part of the PD2 certification credential. One of the super badges prerequisites that's going to expire, that's going to retire on October 11, 2021. If you are currently working on this super badge, so if so, then try to complete it before October 11, or otherwise you will no longer have the ability to learn this super badge. If you already completed, that's fine. That credential will appear in your Trailblazer profile. The next update, I can say the Salesforce certification days, August 21. So if you are planning any certification, go to register here and then attend the webinar. The Salesforce experts will guide the certification, all the topics. Then the next one, I can say like if you are earning your first Salesforce certification in between September 1 to November 30, then you will get the free certification voucher. So you can use that free certification voucher for you or your fellow Trailblazer as a bonus. Usually buy one get one bonus. So try to utilize. Many of them already completed the certification. Then it's not applicable for you. It's applicable only you are getting very first Salesforce certification. So maybe pass it to your circles, whoever looking the Salesforce industry. The next one, JavaScript developer one partner certification. Like if your company is a partner, then Salesforce give away the certification voucher. So go to fill this in the Google form. I will share it in the email, all the updates. And then finally, share your love to the social channels about the Trailblazer community group, leaders, or event speakers in the social channels. In that note, I hand over to Jose. Before that, use the chat window for the Q&A, and we'll discuss in the session. And also, if you are looking any job or hiring or have any Salesforce related announcement, feel free to share it in the chat window. So in that note, I'm hand over to Jose. Over to you, Jose. Please share your screen and intro about yourself, and go ahead. And stop sharing.
Cool. All right. Let's see if I can get this running first try. Press the share screen button. I'll do this. And if everything is good, then hopefully we can see a bit of the slide.
Yeah, I can see your PPT. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So I'll start with the agenda. It's a really logical place to start off. We're in full screen right now. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or I guess g'day everyone. My name is Josh Dennis, and today I think we'll be able to cover off a lot of interesting content around designing Salesforce solutions for reuse. A little bit about myself. I don't have nearly as many socials as I've likely had, but my name is Josh Dennis. I'm a Salesforce functional lead at Unofficials here in Sydney, Australia. Got 14 Salesforce certs. I think it makes a big difference here and there, but my most recent one I got was a Salesforce UX designer. For the people who received the LWCS and looking for something interesting with you, I'd absolutely recommend looking at the UX certification. It's a really interesting way of looking at both the way that Salesforce take on UX, but also some of the more sort of technical items that you should be considering around user experience. A couple of very brief points about myself. I'm fairly passionate about reducing complexity and using platform strengths when we're talking about Salesforce. So whether that is ensuring that when we're looking at business processes and the sorts of things that we're representing in systems, we can really leverage the strength of the Salesforce platform. I've played many roles in the past. I've been working as a functional lead and a VA quite often. In the past, I've also touched on proxy product ownership roles, which is again more on the requirements VA and almost like Salesforce strategy side of things. And also in the Salesforce solution design and architecture space as well. So I've had a pretty good exposure to a lot of different parts of the platform. And I think it's been really informing what I'm going to be talking about today, which is all about using your Salesforce instance to really leverage a lot of utility and ensuring that we can sort of design solutions that can continue to be reused in the future as well. So the first thing I'm going to kick off here with is, your CRM is a product, which might be a bit of an interesting thing to think about sometimes. You might be thinking, I'm not an ISV. I'm not someone who develops products to sell based off the F exchange. Why are you talking about building a product? Why are you talking about products? So to answer that question, it's probably important to consider a couple of points, and I'll also explain why this is useful overall as well, and the scope of what we're talking about today. Why is Salesforce being purchased in the first place by your organization or the client's organization for a consultant or a contractor? Some of the marketing that we see all the time is that Salesforce helps brands and companies to deliver fantastic experiences to customers. It helps organizations manage their end-to-end sales, support, or marketing, or e-commerce, or other processes. And I think a particularly important point, probably for our audience here today, is that it allows people to quickly develop and deploy functionality on a low-code platform. Now, what that means for us is that we can very quickly and very, with much agility, adapt to changing market conditions, and adapt to changing, parts of the world, and really sort of roll out new functionality and new areas for our users to, engage with their customers in a pretty short term. Obviously, with the last 18 months or so with the coronavirus, lots of companies around the world have had to pivot and change their business processes or add new ones to adapt to a pretty wild world. And the Salesforce platform has really enabled business agility. The way that that's been enabled, I suppose, to some extent, is through the low-code platform and through having administrators and people who might not necessarily have a software engineering degree or a software engineering background, being able to still to create and roll out complex functionality using code tools, which of course is a strength of the Salesforce platform. CRM product owners ultimately are going to be aiming to deliver value to the business through the identification, prioritization, and delivery of ultimately valuable CRM functionality. Again, I'm not sure if every organization is going to have a product owner in the Scrum definition sense, but almost inevitably, when you're working with organizations, whether you be a consultant or a contractor working with a client, or if you're in a organization as the Salesforce, like local on-hand support, there's a really good chance it's going to be someone or quite a few people who might be calling the shots in a product ownership role. Again, defining CRM strategy, defining how what the roadmap and the functionality that we've determined needs to be built over the next 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months is, and how that aligns with the strategy and the overall goals of the organization. So for each of these product backlog items, your PO or product owner is going to be asking themselves and their teams, how can I use the strengths of this product being Salesforce, to deliver the best possible functionality to our users? Now, if we put all these different sort of points together, ultimately we start talking about, well, I've got a low-code platform, which is really complex and allows me to basically manage my business, manage all these processes within the business, and allow me to interact with my customers a lot more effortlessly, with a lot more engagement. I've got this platform which I as a product owner might be looking at every day to understand what I can do to help my users and help my company connect with our customers better. Or for example, in the public situation, maybe it's our citizens, maybe it's our members if you're working for a membership-based company. But at the end of the day, you'll ultimately have stakeholders. So how do we use the functionality of Salesforce to give the best possible functionality to our users, but also roll it out in a way that makes sense, in a way that we can just sustainably deliver nice, useful functionality without investing in a huge amount of development capacity? So this next slide here, I guess, is a central theme, or maybe the north star of this conversation today. How can we, as developers, shift from developing purely to enable business productivity to developing to also enable admin productivity? Again, if you think about it, right, we've got a Salesforce organization which is going to have administrators, developers, going to have business analysts, testing teams, users, of course, a huge amount of different people. What we can do as developers, unsurprisingly, if we get requirements, we can throw lines of code at it. We can throw automations at it, try and make the problem be solved. We can go and test it, make sure the business accepts it, and it's all well and good. But a lot of the platform's functionality isn't necessarily something that only a developer can do. And many organizations don't want to rely purely on developers in order to make the system churn and do the work it's supposed to. So how can we take that sort of lens in the way that we're developing things? And how can we start saying, okay, well, instead of simply saying, I'm going to develop this and write the Apex class and deploy it to production and hope it's all good, shift that thinking to how can I write an Apex class or some sort of automation or functionality that can then be adopted by an administrator or adopted by someone who doesn't have a software engineering background to leverage and extend myself. So in the future, if I receive a requirement, I don't have to go knock on the door of the dev who's probably really, really busy with umpteen amounts of things to do, and allow the admins to start trying to solve some of these problems, some of these complex problems that previously would have required code, with our idea of what we can actually use instead, what's been pre-designed for us. So this next slide I'm going to be talking about here, identifying functional patterns and requirements, it's probably more aligned to maybe a functional analyst or maybe a solution architect. But what I'm trying to get to is a couple of strategies around how to start identifying these requirements up front, and then I'll be pivoting into a more sort of show and tell code sort of situation, looking at some of the hands-on experiences. So identifying functional patterns and requirements, it's a bit of a mouthful, but what I'm really getting at fundamentally is we will probably receive, if we're working on a new piece of work in the organization, or if we're working on a statement of work provided to us as a consultancy or as a contractor for an organization, we're going to be receiving a ton of requirements. One of the approaches, and if you're familiar with UX, as I guess partially alluded to earlier, a technique that comes up quite often is the idea of card sorting, which is the way that we can group requirements into common categories and subcategories, or group anything into categories and subcategories, which helps us structure our thinking and helps us identify these common themes that come up again and again and again. What this often ends up looking like is what we call a capability map, which might include the functionality and scope. I'm not sure if you can see the graphic clearly. Hopefully you can, but if you can't, if you just were to Google Salesforce capability map, then you'll see this example taken from a website called raddiff.com, which explains Salesforce functionalities. In this case, it's by cloud, but it's a nice way of aggregating different functionalities of the platform by cloud or by license even. And that sort of is a nice way to say, okay, well, given these sort of parts of the system, what are the things that keep recurring back to me? What are the areas and what are the things that the business requires that are common across 3 or 4 or 5 different business units? It's a bit of a consulting buzzword, but once you're at this point, you can start doing things like applying Michi principles, Michi consulting buzzword that basically stands for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. How can we, sorry, my webcam is going this way, and I'm not sure if I'm looking actually at the webcam or not, so apologies for those who can see the camera because I can't. Hopefully it's looking good here. But applying these idea of what's mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive to determine the functionalities that underpin our requirements. Again, if we have a list of all these different things that are part of our requirements or part of our scope of the solution, and we start identifying, hey, this has come up here and here and here, same sort of thing or a very similar thing keeps coming up, that's something which is, again, a functional requirement that we might need to sort of focus on. We might just start thinking, let's not tactically resolve it once and then do it again later on, and then 2 months later do it again. Let's try and architect that requirement up front. Let's try and understand if it's going to keep coming again and again and again, how we can try and design it once and then implement it multiple times using that same sort of framework. So for each of these categories and subcategories, we should be considering things like, have we already delivered it? Is this functionality that is being requested that already exists in the org? Is it something that instead of having to redesign a new process to enable this, perhaps we can just go in and use the existing one? Or perhaps on the flip side, maybe the existing one hasn't been designed as well as it could have been, or hasn't been designed to scale, and maybe that becomes a bit more of the technical debt of the solution. Maybe we need to reevaluate that, given the requirements we understood then as well as what we understand now, and re-implement. Additionally, maybe there's a Salesforce product we could use to do for this. Maybe, for example, the requirements, in some cases aligned to field service management or workforce management. And maybe we can use, hey, wait a second, let's use field service lightning or lightning scheduler to enable this work management. That way we can keep our one invoice out to, we can be paying our ones that are billed to Salesforce each month. We can keep things nice and consistent. Or maybe on the flip side, we can use an app exchange product to look at this. Maybe it's something like a workforce app exchange product like Scheduler that we could use to manage it that aligns more to our expectations. Maybe it's cheaper, or maybe it's just better fit for what we need to do. And then finally, is this a problem that may be solved in a different system across the enterprise? Maybe the requirement is something a bit more generic, like maintaining data quality. maybe there's already like a Snowflake instance or a S3 bucket that we have, which has some sort of process or automation that is already cleansing data. It might not necessarily reduce the complexity, but maybe from a sort of architecture review board or a change governance board, you can say, hey, we've at least considered the fact that the finance team has this process, and we've got these processes that we separate, but we're aware of them existing, and then in the future, maybe we take an integration approach. We can start designing one cohesive solution across the enterprise. As a real quick example, I didn't want to write an entire statement of work for this example, but let's say for argument's sake, we receive some requirements from a potential customer. In this case, we're ABC Bank, who has a CRM definition project to support the following business processes, blah, 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 onboarding new customers, blah, 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 handle ad hoc customer support calls and external complaints, and we might need to do something about that. From a sort of functional and solution architecture perspective, we might look at the different sort of functionality, and given our understanding of the industry as well as our understanding of the company, you might say, okay, well, for the onboarding customers stream, we might do these 8 items. And then from the customer support stream, hey, there's another 6 that we need to do. But if we're stepping through these, you might say, hey, wait a second, there's a couple of commonalities that we've determined. So in this case over here, hey, wait a second, we actually have record assignment, call scripting, inbound or outbound communication. These are common things that occur across 2 or maybe more than 2 different business units or different sort of groups of requirements. And we're taking our card sorting approach and start working through to understand what's mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Maybe these are the items that we can prioritize from a solution architecture perspective, saying, hey, wait a second, how can we design, using Salesforce's tools and Salesforce's functionality, a way that allows us to do record assignment, define it once, and then implement it in 5 or 6 other requirements throughout the scheme of the project. So where to from here? I know that I'm probably rushing a little bit because I want to get to probably one of the more interesting and fun parts, being the code part of the session. But so far what we've done is looking at things from almost like a product owner or product strategy perspective, in terms of what we need to do and how we can use the system, and then maybe some of those priorities around how we do that. From your requirements and almost, again, your solution architecture perspective, what are the ones that recur, what are the ones that we need to prioritize in terms of how we're building out the system. And in that respect, from here, from this sort of point, we'll probably start solutioning the requirement. Given what we know, how important the requirement is, how important the timelines we have to provide by, where it's likely to be used, how should we go about solutioning this, bring it to life? Are there out-of-the-box or app exchange products we can use here? Can we do this through configuration? Perhaps do we do this through custom development or a combination thereof? And additionally, another really key, really important part is the documentation behind it as well. If we are designing something to be reused and something that can be architected once and then applied multiple times, we will also definitely...
Sorry to interrupt. Actually, your voice is very low only. Maybe can you try to speak with very close? Your mic is, your volume is very low.
Okay,
and
sorry.
Also in your background, we are getting some sound actually.
Really?
Yeah, some.
I love doing ad hoc.
Okay, yeah, I think now it's better. Yeah.
Now it's okay. I won't touch anything. I'll go back to presentation, and please just call out if it's sounding a bit quiet. Okay, hopefully we are okay.
Keep continuing.
My room's very quiet. I can't hear anything else. Cool. All right. Documentation. If we are going to be designing something to be repeatable, if we're designing something to be done once and done well, how should we document it? And how should we try to ensure that when we are handing it over to, for example, an admin or someone who doesn't have a technical, sophisticated understanding, what do we need to do in order to ensure that they can adopt this sort of thing? In as much as for someone who's been involved in handover of a project to a business as usual team with a bunch of people who may not have been as involved in developing it. What do they need? What do our admins need, for example, to adopt this and start using it themselves? Cool. Now, this is a slide that a lot of people probably have seen before. I'm not trying to sell you anything, but what I am going to tell you about and sort of talk about for the next, probably the majority of what I'm going to be saying for the rest of the slide presentation is I'm not a great dev. What I am about to go through is a couple of the experiences that I have had in writing generic Lightning Web Components, and in my experiences of, in some respect, teaching myself about developing these sort of components that can be ultimately, plug and play, develop at once and apply to many, orgs, let alone many different business processes. I'll be getting into the code. I think that's something that I think a lot of the people in this call would enjoy. But if you are learning development, or if you're someone who is trying to look at this as an example of, absolutely perfect development, this is not that necessarily. People will probably sort of say, hey, wait a second, you could have done this a bit differently. I totally accept that. What I'm trying to explain for the next bit of this is just that, hey, this is the, the patterns and approaches I've used to start developing, configurable and reusable LWCs across the across Salesforce organizations. So with that out of the way, what I want to do is talk through a bit of the design process of creating, generic Lightning Web Components that can be used again and again and again. The first step of this is all about UI design. Again, depending on how your organization works, a developer may be more or less involved in the overall wireframing and the user interface design. But the first step I always do when I get a requirement or come up with a thought around how I want to represent something generically is to get the pen and paper out. I create a low fidelity wireframe, which is literally pen on paper, and I try to understand and annotate the areas that need to are important ultimately. Hopefully on the screen you can see my an example of something I've done before, and this is a really useful approach, because ultimately you can start getting input from all of your stakeholders, maybe your product owner, maybe your users, and especially your admins, or the people who will ultimately be taking this and applying it to solve their own business challenges. So what you can see I've done is I've taken a pretty basic interface. I've started annotating, for example, using our Lightning-based components, the kinds of areas and the kinds of things I expect to be able to use. So in this case, we've got a peak square. Hey, that's a Lightning card. A record form. Hey, these are the fields that we included in a record form. The bottom on the right-hand side, there's a progress ring in the middle. I've also called out a couple of things, like, for example, where a user might define some of the configuration variables where these fields exist, or maybe, for example, when we need to iterate the component to show again and again and again for the different records to show. This is important because not only does it help us bring the admins and our product owners and the people who give us the requirements on the journey around what we can and can't do pretty easily, but by having a developer involved in the early stages of designing a user interface, it helps us understand, like, for example, maybe our UI designer, for example, doesn't have much Salesforce experience, and they've done something that makes sense to them. That'll be a pattern they've used in a different sort of like a website, for example. But as we know, while the LWC framework does align to web components, Salesforce gives us a huge amount of out-of-the-box functionality that we can leverage in terms of like the Lightning-based components. And if we can align how the design of the component is to how Salesforce's Lightning design system and the base components work, then we can probably speed up the development quite a bit. We can make it look nice and pretty, and ultimately have users enjoy using the UI a lot more. This sort of approach of determining what is on the page, determining how these things will be used and developed, allows us to understand what should be configurable and what can easily be supported through that. Maybe, for example, the admin says, hey, I want to be able to support how big it is, how wide it is, or how many fields are on one page. And maybe that's the sort of conversation we can have really early, that we say, hey, it's actually quite difficult to do that, given what we've said over here, or it won't be very good look. So by being able to have these low fidelity mock-ups, whether it's pen and paper, whether it's in PowerPoint, whether it's in a tool like Miro, for example, sometimes simply squares and arrows and some very basic words and labels might solve or at least might help a really challenging conversation otherwise. After we do the low fidelity, unsurprisingly, we'll probably want to start converting into a high fidelity mockup. And by that, I mean, for example, converting our low fidelity into a basic Lightning Web component, for example, or perhaps something in Sketch, but I'm not as big a fan of Sketch because I don't have the Mac and can't use it. But starting to build a bit of a basic Lightning Web component, which is ultimately hard-coded. If we're in a developer org, for example, or a sandbox instance, and we can start dragging and dropping something onto the page, users can screen share, for example, and a bit of a playback, we can start to again bring them along that journey and actually have them visualize how they're going to use this. When, for example, I took the screen over here, I think I took a couple of hours and created a basic LWC like what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. I realized a couple of things. I realized, for example, I needed some way to shrink it. So I threw an accordion component in there to help manage, showing multiple bits of data in the one screen. I realized that the Lightning progress ring, that green thing under the title, was actually quite difficult to manage from, it doesn't get very big and it wasn't very useful for me ultimately. So I threw that away pretty quickly in. By preparing a high fidelity or a simple markup component, it allows you as a developer to quickly, or at least more quickly, break it into clear components and identify the kinds of data that needs to be queried for or returned by your Apex or Lightning Data Service logic. By the way, I actually can't see the comments, unfortunately, so if there's a good conversation going, please feel free to come off mute and ask questions if there's anything pertinent. Otherwise, hopefully there'll be time at the end to go through any of the questions as well. So what I want to do, and now this is where I'll start alt-tabbing around a little bit, hopefully I don't lose everyone, is talking about a couple of, in this case, for example, common configurable attributes that you might be thinking about, or that we might be having developed when we start working through generic, Lightning Web components, things that we can, use, expose to admins, and have them apply themselves. The first element is, our targets. When we create an LWC, one of the first files that gets created is the meta.xml file, the JavaScript meta file. And one of the sections there is targets, where can we actually place the LWC we're developing. Often this is going to be something which we embed on a record page, sometimes on the home screen. Maybe we're throwing it into a flow, a screen flow, for example. There's a number of other ones as well. I think, like, for example, with communities, the utility bar at the bottom of the screen, kind of think about where this should be placed, and if we need to be actually specifically covering any other areas. A really key and really basic one, but important, is the idea of titles and icons. If we're developing a component, and let's say for argument's sake, I'll keep going back to this example, but if we're creating something which is on the account page and is showing child contact information, then it might be called my contacts, for example. And it might have the icon of an account or a contact or whatever it is. Later on, we might use that same component on our contact page, showing all the opportunities associated with that contact. We probably can't use that same, my contacts of showing opportunity information, or if we're hard-coded at the title, for example, or hard-coded the icon, even if it is generic, users might get really confused if they're seeing that same component being used in 5 different areas across the organization. If they have the same information, the same title, the same icon. So being able to allow a admin to configure the title and the icon is a really nice way to help personalize the experience a bit more. I'll also have the code document to show this a little more clearly, but also how to query for records display if we're showing child records. Again, if we're using a component that's on the account page and showing all of our child account records, then how are we determining what fields to show, what records to show? Should the admin provide an entire SOQL statement? It can be done. It can give a lot of flexibility. There are some security concerns to have. Obviously, want to make sure it's very clean in the processing in the back of the Apex. And it also assumes that the admin has understanding of SOQL, which might not always be the case. An approach I've used quite often is instead where we break it down, and in our design components, we have sections that say insert comma separated fields. And then for our from part of the query, insert the object API name that we're trying to query from. For our where, again, in a very common circumstance, you might be trying to query for the child records of a parent object. So you might be asking for, what's the relationship API name of the field? Sorry, what is the field API name of the relationship that we're using? Again, if you're doing account contact, then we need to be looking at account ID to connect the contact record to the account. If you need to do anything else, for example, like, created days in the last 2 weeks or something similar, then that can be quite complex as well. So you have to think quite a bit about how we want to allow users to configure as we need to, admins to configure as we need to. Finally, order by, limit, any of the safe SOQL security parts also to include there, because ultimately, if we are constructing a SOQL query, we need to make sure that we have as much control as we expect our users to need to. Anything which is UI specific as well, again, I'll tab into an example in just a second. But if we have, for example, a very specific UI that we might need to give, think about other things that we can expose to our admins to configure. And then very finally, if we expect this to be used in a screen flow, then what I've noticed is that the Lightning Web Component framework will natively pass in a record ID from like a Lightning record page. But if you're using a screen flow, you may need to specifically expose the record ID parameter to allow the screen flow to pass in, for example, we're looking at, account ID 001, blah, blah, blah. So just a bit of a call out there. I'm going to alt tab into my Salesforce. And very quickly, I want to show you an example of this. This is my account page, and you can see up to the right-hand side, I've got a component which basically allows me to look at some information from my child contacts. If I click on my locations tab, then what I've developed is it looks very similar actually. And in fact, these two things we see on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side are the same component. But when I was taking in my own requirement to build this out, what I decided that was important is being able to use this in multiple circumstances. If I go into my Lightning App Builder, for example, I won't go through this in detail because there's only so much time for this meeting. There's a lot more things to get through. But if I have a quick look at the configuration, we can see, for example, I can choose my account icon, my card icon pretty easily. I can change the name of the what we're displaying here. I can change the field names to include in the query. And then at the very end, for example, what I also have is some of the attributes that the Lightning Map base component allows me to configure. So I can, for example, show where the person should be on a map. I can also enable, for example, if it should be like a heat map with a circle indicator and how big that radius of it should be. So for example, I've just made a quick change there. And I can apply this component to the account page, the contact page, the opportunity page. Maybe, for example, I can use this in a COVID contract tracing kind of way, where I can say, hey, this person had 10 stops today. And they were here, here, and here. And anyone in these areas are at risk. Or I can flip immediately and say, hey, maybe this is actually something I can use for my sales reps. Maybe I want to be able to give them a list of the key addresses or contacts that they need to talk to today. And here's where each of those stops in their sales journey are. The way that we sort of represent this in the meta file itself is through, like I said, the JavaScript meta XML, where I've defined, for example, that its targets are only going to be a Lightning record page, and the configuration variables in that Lightning record page config. You can see what I picked this here for all the different card icons. You probably don't need to have this many, but again, I was playing around with it. And then, for example, the other properties. These are the sorts of things that then get fed into the Lightning Web Components JavaScript file, and then also we pass into, as needed, into the FX controller to help us query for the information and construct the payload as we require. back into the PowerPoint, or just the Google Slides. So this next part, I think, is also quite important. Once we have developed something, how should we allow an admin to actually configure it? Obviously, 4 options. There may be a couple more, but I think these are probably the most common ones. The first one being Lightning App Builder config. We just saw it a second ago, but how do we, how do we expose the variables or the parameters that we want an admin to be able to configure themselves? And the most basic way is going to be through the Lightning App Builder itself. The second approach, what I've seen before to varying levels of success, is by having a field called, dataset, for example, over here on the screen, but basically a long text field or a text field which has a very long limited string, but we just copy and paste a JSON object in there. This is fraught with risk, I will say, because it's very common that an admin won't necessarily be able to generate the JSON payload as expected, or won't know how to make small changes. And then if, for example, there are issues, you have to debug, is the JSON object that's wrong? Is it how I process the JSON that's wrong? Or maybe both of those things are fine, and there's actually some application logic as well. However, this is also very quick and will allow a developer to very quickly and easily do proof of concepts, or to see, hey, can I expose these sort of parameters in a way that makes sense? The third option here, custom metadata types, is something that I've used again before, and we'll give a quick demo of how I've done this in an example just in a moment. The custom metadata types obviously allow you as a developer to define your schema, define the sort of data you expect. And then on the DevOps side of things as well, you can deploy these custom metadata types pretty easily without needing to have any dependencies on creating data manually post-deployment, deploying from one sandbox to another one. So if you're doing something which requires quite a lot of thought, or for example, you might have, a lot of parameters to configure, then consider using custom metadata types in your allowing for admin configuration. Finally, something which is pretty interesting, I think it's only been available for about a year or so at this point, is a custom property editor. I don't have an example of this on hand, but ultimately it's kind of like a Lightning Web Component that you put inside of the configuration of another Lightning Web Component. There's probably a meme you can make about that, but ultimately it's almost like a front end for your admins or your people in the Lightning App Builder screen to go and configure something. It's almost like the best of both worlds, because you get of the JSON and the custom metadata types, because you allow your admins a really nice interface to configure things, but also giving a nice graphical way of making it pretty easy within the Lightning App Builder or the Flow developer screen itself. It can be a bit more difficult to do the development of this though compared to the other ones. What I'll do really quickly again is get back into my Salesforce. I'll give you a quick look at what I've done, for example, on the custom metadata types. So if I look over here, actually what I'll do first is have a look at what the actual Salesforce looks like behind it. Actually, I'm already here, so I may as well scroll down a little bit. So this is another example that I'm playing around with, where ultimately all I'm doing is trying to show the key fields on a child contact that need to be completed for us to consider it complete. And what I've done is I've exposed a custom metadata type called required field configuration called parent test. If I look at the custom metadata types in my org, what I've then done is created two actually objects. So the parent test, for example. And this basically, as a custom metadata type, is what I've, as an admin, determined. I want to look at the rating field, for example, on the contact record, the relationship field, API name of contact ID. And then I've got some child metadata records over here that allow me to determine how things should look like as I progress through different stages of my account. To be honest, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense in the context of what I'm talking about, but I really hope that you can appreciate the ease that custom metadata can be done, can allow you as a developer to expose to your admins. So I'd like to call out a couple of considerations in the Apex space you might need to think about when developing custom Lightning Web components as well. The first one being, consider what parameters you're passing in from the Lightning Web component. I would say in virtually every instance, you'll probably be passing in the record ID from the record, again, something which is managed pretty handily through the platform itself. There's also going to be a number of configurable attributes from the Lightning App Builder. We've just talked about a couple. So some examples being if we have got a select these fields from this object where record ID equals this, for example. Just have a think about them up front and try to, what I always do is I start preparing what that query might be to return my data in execute anonymous. And then once I'm more comfortable, we'll start creating the Apex. Once I'm comfortable with what that output is going to look like, now it can be consumed by the Lightning Web component. Think to how you're going to define the data structure they're returning from the Apex controller. Will you use a wrapper class, or can you use the standard output of a SOCL, or maybe perhaps a SOCL statement? If you are, for example, using custom metadata types, you might need to do an initial get metadata call, or call out to a method to return that sort of information. And by getting your metadata first, then obviously the Lightning Web component can start building and structuring what it needs to. Get records, again, on almost every instance, you'll be querying for record data within Salesforce. So again, just think about the component pieces that you need in order to query. Again, maybe if you do need your fields or your object or your relationship API name, how are you going to pass that in? So final point, I'm sure many of the people in the call will know about this already, but if you're working with Service Cloud objects, they don't have a name field. They will have, for example, a case number or a service appointment number, for example. If you're trying to code an Apex, a SOCL, for example, and assume that all you can say, select ID name from, doesn't matter, wherever it is. If you try and put it on a case, then you'll get an error because case doesn't have a name field. And that's tripped me up a couple of times earlier on. What I'll do is quickly have a look at this controller that I have. So in this case, we are returning a wrapper class, and then the way that I had to build this, because there was a pretty complex chain of querying for the initial parent metadata record, then querying for the record ID, or I guess the record that I want to be exposing itself, for example, our account record. And you can see I'm constructing that SOCL query, select ID plus the stage API field name derived from the custom metadata. And then later on, I have to go and query for the child record custom metadata type that meets the criteria established in this query. And then I actually have to get the records from my contact records, again, by constructing a SOCL query, which will allow me to do that. So thinking about ways that we can structure the callouts and the different methods we use in order to get to our output is quite important. There's probably a better way of doing this, but I also have a method that I keep using called setNameField, where, for example, if the object is a case or a work order or whatever it is, then what that name field's API name should be, because it's certainly not named, unless it is. Final point here about Apex or Lightning Data Service for field data. Right now I'm sort of approaching time and make sure I don't too much. Apex generally has worked more consistently for me. The reason why is because even though Lightning Data Service is really, really, really nice and there's a lot of performance and functionality, Apex has been more flexible. Apex allows, you can still sort of imperatively call your Apex methods in the LWCS itself, and you can still manage the cache to some extent. But Lightning Data Service, when you're dealing with dynamic generation of data or queries, for example, if you see on the left-hand side, we can't do our import of question mark field from question mark schema, because sometimes it might be importing the opportunity ID and name from the opportunity, and then the same component later on, a different implementation might be querying for the contact name. So what I've seen happens what I've seen work best for me in the past, at least, is by imperatively calling your Apex methods or using a custom wire calling out to a Apex method rather than how the Lightning Data Service works. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be using it. And for example, on the right-hand side, there's an example of how I've been able to dynamically determine the number of fields in a wire, where, for example, in my connected callback, I said that take whatever object is and add .id at the end, and then the wire itself, all I wanted to do was monitor that wire for any changes to that record. I can pass in my dynamically determined ID field from the connected callback over here, which is a nice way of, I guess, to some extent, allowing me to both use Lightning Data Service as well as Apex to solve my needs. I'm going to really quickly speed through a couple of resources from the community. The reason why, if we think back to the very, very start of what I was talking about, these are the same sorts of things. They're completely generic. They're things that people can install into their orgs, get admins to start leveraging, and can be very useful in giving them more advanced Salesforce functionality than they may otherwise have had. So, for example, Unofficial SF is a website or a blog run by Alex Edelstein, who I believe is a senior Salesforce product manager for Flows. The guy's a genius, and he's really, really passionate about the community and the product, which is shown through the website. You can go to that website, look at the flow screen components section, and there are tons of LWCs and other functionalities that you can sort of install into your org very easily and get really rich functionality for your flow screens. There's for people who are more interested in logs and perhaps from an integration perspective, there's this functionality called Nebula Logger, which is, again, a fantastic way to install into your org. There's a GitHub repo available, which you can use to, again, have a really great level of traceability around logs and events that happen in your org. And then, I think surprising no one, Salesforce Labs is also a fantastic resource that you can install components from built by Salesforce employees in the Salesforce community. A couple of my favorites are the CMDT enhanced related lists, where you can define related lists in custom metadata, then throw them onto a record page. Time Warp, which is a very, very configurable timeline view, and Lightning Web Chart.js component, which essentially is a way that you can create report charts easily through data on your Salesforce org. It's, again, fairly configurable. What I'll talk about for literally about 2 minutes or so now is an example of how we can do this in an object-agnostic way, not only from the developer or LWC side of things, but also in terms of what we might be more comfortable with from a flow side of the world. So again, I'm going to quickly jump into Salesforce and talk through what we can see on the right-hand side over here. One of the requirements I had in a previous project was that we needed to validate the address of a person. We don't want the users to update the address themselves. We have to give a very specific window to do that and call out to an address validation service. I don't have the address validation service, but the idea here is that we wanted to make sure that on the lead screen, the account screen, the contact screen, it all looks exactly the same. You see the same sort of process. And we were able to do that through a fairly extensible flow. So for example, over here, I can change my street address, save or next or whatever it is, I hope it works. And then, we can update the address through that sort of interface. This is on a lead. On a contact, same sort of thing. I can use exactly the same look and feel and the same sort of process, but in different objects. As we know, flows are not dependent on one given object. We can do many. So whenever this works, I'll very quickly start off by going into my Lightning App Builder to show how we pass variables into the flow itself. So we obviously specify our flow. We pass in the record ID, but we also pass in what I'm calling a context variable. So in this case, it's contact, unsurprisingly. If we had multiple addresses, if we have, like, for example, a billing address and a mailing address, you might, for example, have contact.billing, contact.mailing, whatever it is, as long as we are consistent with it. In the flow itself, we start off not necessarily with a get records, but with a decision to say, okay, what's the context? This is obviously passed in from the Lightning App Builder, and we can see in this case, in this decision, we're saying, hey, it's a lead or it's a contact. And depending on that outcome, we then jump into it itself. It's important to establish, from my eyes, a bit of a canonical data model. So in this case over here, we're mapping our values from lead. We've created all these records. We've created all these fields, and we're mapping them to a pretty basic schema or a basic data structure. And then, for example, in the screen itself, all we're saying is refer to not necessarily what we queried for, because we might have queried 8 different objects, but using the variables that we defined just a bit earlier. Then, of course, same sort of thing. We're going to update these variables based on what was in the screen. And then if it was a lead or a contact, again, all we need to do is say that in this case, the context is lead, the context is account, and then we can go and update this again. If, for example, we need to also support the account object, then you have to do a little bit of work, but all it's really doing is creating a new decision over here, new get records over here, and map that information back over here. And then finally, again, do the same thing for our decision L over here, where we say if it's a contact or if it's an account or whatever it is, update the information over here. I've done something similar with orchestrating communications in the past, where, for example, if we need to send a notification to someone, an email to someone, and an SMS to someone all in the same flow, architect it, design it up front, try and use the same sort of process across multiple different instances. And I've used, for example, custom metadata types to map together a template for an SMS, template for an email, and a template for notification in one go. So instead of us having to do this sort of web of flows again and again and again for every email or communication we send out, all we need to do is in a process builder, for example, indicate what the custom metadata type name is, what the record ID is, and then the system does it all for us, assuming we have that custom metadata in there in the first place. A real quick final call out as well is if you're using MuleSoft, or even if you're not, but if you are, especially so, consider using external services, which are basically ways that you can surface, more or less integration in a flow and use, pass your Salesforce data into an external service. It will do its magic. On the flip side, Salesforce will handle the integration for you, more or less, assuming you do the basic fair stuff. And then, you can basically, start preparing external services to use in your Salesforce environment without doing too much work if they get set up correctly. Last slide, I promise. I know I'm also very much running out of time, but ultimately, closing thoughts and questions, think about how well do you know your admins and product owners? How process and object agnostic can you make the next development item? If a request comes in or you're working on something, think about, hey, can I make this generic? Is there value in making something generic? Because I guarantee you, it might not be the next one that you look at, but eventually you'll find that ways that, hey, expose something that your admins can use and they can take some of the development burden from you instead. Finally, what opportunities to refactor or simplify your org can you identify? It's a sort of thing that maybe doesn't get done this week, this month, or even this year. But by starting to have that conversation around, hey, we've done the same thing, 8 different locations, let's do it, let's architect it well, do it once, because you will inevitably be able to speed up the time to deliver and develop these sort of functionalities, especially if you allow, you do the bare work and then allow your admins to do the rest of it for you. That's basically it from me. I've not seen the questions, so I'm going to alt-tab now quickly and see what that looks like. Feel free to come off mute, ask me questions as well. Happy to hear through.
Anyone have any questions? Use chat window. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful session. Maybe if anyone have any question, just to reach out to Joe or me in the social channels. We'll be happy to take that. Maybe I will share my screen and then we'll decide who's the lucky winner for the voucher. Congratulations all the winners. Thank you once again for joining the session. I think it's a very informative. Hope you guys loved about the session. Once again, I thank you, Joe, for sharing your knowledge to the Trailblazer community group. Thank you all, and please stay safe and healthy. We will see you again with another amazing event. Thank you all.